Earlier this year, shortly after the neo-Nazi murderer Dylan Roof had shot up a black church, the Washington Post reported on a stunning fact. By 24th of July, 204 days of the year had passed, and there had been one mass shooting in the US for each day of the year. A mass shooting, for the record, is one in which 4 or more people are shot. These shootings, it reports, have become so common that they typically don't even make national news. CNN, meanwhile, provided a list of the 27 deadliest mass shootings in US history. Almost all had taken place in the last 30 years, and just over half had taken place in the last 10 years. The Scientific American reports that the US is 5th in all OECD nations for homicide and has hosted half of the worst massacres carried out in the world in the last 30 years. What's more, the nature of the shootings suggests that America suffers from a more deranged type of violence, in that in a study of school shootings in 38 countries, the US accounted for just one less such shooting than all of the other countries put together. What is the cause of these massacres? While most people had picked up on the fact that Dylan Roof was a pro-Confederate racist killer in the tradition of white supremacist terror in the US, President Obama had focused on gun control laws, calling it the greatest frustration of his presidency, as reported by the BBC. 13 Democratic Party politicians are organizing the backing chorus for Obama on this question, and that focus is supported by the liberal wing of the intelligentsia. As Fareed Zakaria argues in the Washington Post, America has had 150,000 gun deaths since 9/11 and done nothing about it. On the liberal end of the media, the focus is almost entirely on gun control. The New York Times and the Washington Post have traditionally editorialized in favor of gun control laws, while the progressive left magazine Mother Jones claims a correlation between the number of guns owned and the number of homicides. But nor is it just liberals. While the debate in America is generally structured between a liberal gun control consensus on the one hand and the right-wing National Rifle Association lobby on the other, the New York Times reports that the far right-wing Louisiana Governor Bobby Jindal has come out for gun control. On the right, the National Review blames the massacres on an American psychosis, and particularly the absence of treatment for the mentally ill. But it presents no evidence that this is the cause of such massacres. Is there a link between mental health and gun violence? Asked the New Yorker. The short answer is no. The longer answer is mental health is too complex a concept to give us a clear answer to that question. Fox News doesn't even bother with this argument. Instead, it brings us the vital news that Toby Keith doesn't think stricter gun control laws will prevent mass shootings. And if the argument is put like that, the liberals are losing. Most Americans, according to the polling company Gallup, seem to believe that guns make them safer. Less than half of them support further gun controls. But what if gun control laws aren't by themselves the issue? The Washington Post reports that household gun ownership is in terminal decline in America. What's more, while some studies find a correlation between gun ownership and homicide rates, as reported, for example, in this New York Times article, it is not straightforward. For example, when the Post reports the global comparisons, it is true that America has both the highest rate of gun ownership in the world and the highest per capita rate of gun homicide. The correlation is not that straightforward in other countries. In Russia, for example, which has one of the highest homicide rates, but also one of the lower rates of civilian gun ownership. And despite the growing number of individual mass shootings, CNN reports that gun-related homicides and crimes are strikingly down from 20 years ago, just like most other crimes. In 2012, the Washington Post posed the question itself: why are mass shootings becoming more common? The answer? It didn't have one. The Post speculated that perhaps media attention to these massacres creates a copycat scenario and suggests a possible link to mental health, but it ultimately admitted that it's not entirely clear why massacres are on the rise. This suggests that in the media debate between a right wing determined to defend gun ownership and a liberal wing determined to blame gun ownership, both sides of the debate are banging their heads against a brick wall. There are a number of deeper issues here which the US media is constitutionally incapable of addressing within its narrow framework of debate. The first is inequality. You have to look to the overseas press, for example, this article in Canada's Globe and Mail, to find the issue addressed at all. And yet, this is what study after study after study finds to be a key cause of violent crime, gun crime included. As this article in the Scientific America summarizes the research, the issue is not lower average incomes or unemployment, but specifically inequality. The second is why there are so many guns. It's easy to blame the National Rifle Association or even the gun lobby, but there is a bigger issue that never comes up when there are mass shootings, and that is what is called the gun belt. That is the belt of munitions industries that stretches from the industrial northeast to the south to the western states. Much of the American economy is dependent upon the gun belt. Beginning in the early Cold War, the militarization of the US economy, funded and planned by the Pentagon and a series of related bureaucracies, began to modernize and industrialize the southern and western states and created new layers of workers and professionals dependent upon the production of guns. To its credit, the Washington Post gave some attention to New England's Gun Valley after the Newtown massacre in Connecticut in 2013, but inevitably it ended up narrowing the focus on the gun lobby, an easy target. The harder truth to swallow is that these industries are the creation of the military-industrial complex, which exists not only to project American firepower abroad in Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia, Haiti, and elsewhere, but also to drive commercial success. The problems of inequality and the militarization of the American economy then become tangled up with one other factor to create a deadly combination. That third factor is social competition. Mark Ames, formerly editor of the Gonzo publication Exiled, cited this and the culture of sadistic bullying in schools and workplaces that goes with it to explain the spread of mass shootings in the US. And this seems to be supported in studies. As Eric Michael Johnson, summarizing recent research, writes for the Huffington Post, one of the major factors in explaining homicide is the prevalence of competitive as opposed to cooperative behavior. In those areas where community cooperation breaks down and the neoliberal culture of vicious competition takes over, violent crime rates go up, and so does gun ownership. Take these factors in a society with long-standing traditions of racist and sexist violence, and you get Dylan Roof and Elliot Rodgers. Given the complex realities of gun ownership, which aren't dealt with in the media, it is unsurprising that there are some dissidents. Some progressives dissent from the gun control argument. Alex Gurovich, writing for the liberal magazine Salon, for example, argues that gun controls without racial justice will rebound badly on black communities in the US, since gun control laws, just like drug laws, are often used as a pretext for police harassment of African Americans. And indeed, The Atlantic points out in its Secret History of Guns that the emergence of modern gun control laws have a lot to do with controlling black people, from the slavery to the Reconstruction to the Black Panthers. In this, the dissenting liberals are supported by the libertarian magazine Reason, which argues that gun control is the Klan's favourite law. Yet there are some complexities that this argument can't deal with. Household gun ownership today is not a prerogative of the poor, but increasingly has a correlation with property. As this infographic on Marketplace shows, gun ownership is concentrated among those with middle to higher incomes. Research cited by Newsweek shows that in the period from 2010 to 2014, household firearms ownership was higher among households with white respondents than among those with black respondents. Similarly, it was greater among non-Hispanics than among Hispanics. The research also found that gun ownership was higher among respondents in households with higher incomes. It is not poor black people who have amassed the guns in this era, it is comparatively wealthy white people. It is not surprising, therefore, that as Adam Winkler writes for the Daily Beast, the most forceful advocates of the abolition of gun control laws are the Tea Party right, endorsed by the ultra-right-wing Gun Owners of America. A number of states with Tea Party representatives have already passed laws drawing on the old segregationist doctrine of states' rights, saying that the federal government's gun control laws are not legally binding. As Winkler argues, among the middle-class homeowners who simply want the right to own guns in order to shoot at trespassers, There is a far-right insurgency brewing linked to the racist militia movement. When it comes to guns, they're talking about a revolution. What's more, there are permissive gun control laws such as stand your ground legislation, which have driven up the homicide rate and often resulted in racist murders such as that of Trayvon Martin. And there is another problem. Even if gun ownership isn't by itself to blame for the spate of massacres in the US, there's no evidence that gun ownership actually helps anyone. In fact, the Washington Post reports on a recent study into what happens when regular people try to use handguns. The results are often dangerous, they don't know what they're doing, and they shoot some innocent bystander. Yet the problem is that for most of the American media, it's very difficult to have a serious discussion about guns, because they're far more focused on blaming guns or excusing guns than on asking why does a society need this many guns and where do all these mass shootings come from.